Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. So thank you all for coming today. We do have food and coffee and lemonade apparently in the back, which is awesome. I do want to let you all know too, we are giving away some of Dr. Myers's books, which I'm very excited about. They are coming in tomorrow. So if you are signing in and you're all set, then we'll just do a raffle and I will just email you to let you know if you get a book and then you can just come and pick it up. So that is happening. Um, I'm really, really glad to see you all today. My name's Elizabeth McMentatenko, and I'm a librarian here at UC Merced. And I'm really happy to be able to introduce Dr. Kit Myers today, who's going to be giving our Library Faculty Author Series talk. The Faculty Author Series showcases the latest research and scholarship by UC Merced faculty members. And if you'd like to be featured in a future Faculty Author Series talk, please let me know. I'm always looking for more speakers, and it's great to hear from lots of people in lots of different departments and areas. For today, we're thrilled to have Dr. Myers here with us. Dr. Myers is an assistant professor in the Department of History and Critical Race and Ethnic Studies and was previously a Chancellor's Postdoctoral Fellow at UC Merced. In his research, Dr. Myers examines race as a social, relational, and intersectional category of difference and power. He serves on the executive committee of the Alliance for the Study of Adoption and Culture and has published articles in Adoption Quarterly, Critical Discourse Studies, Adoption and Culture, and Amerasia. He has a PhD and MA from UC San Diego in Ethnic Studies and a BS in Ethnic Studies, and Journalism from the University of Oregon. And we're really thrilled to have him here with us today. And I'm going to turn this over now to Kit. Thank you.
All right. Hi, everyone. It's so great to see you morning. We're still in morning. Thank you for being here. And it really warms my heart, especially during this moment when a lot of communities are under attack, to just share some space with you, to talk about my book that just came out January 28th. At the end of the thing, I can leave this up, the QR code, and that'll take you to the UC Press website where you could get access to the free version if you'd like to see that and share it. First, just want to begin by acknowledging the Miwok and Yukut tribes, who are the original peoples of this land. We acknowledge their survival of settler colonialism, displacement, and genocide, but also the work that they continue to do to this day to assert their presence, sovereignty, self-determination, and resistance to settler colonial structures and logics. And I also want to thank, of course, the UC Merced Library, librarian Elizabeth McMentatenko for helping put this event together. And with that, I'll get started. Okay. This is the cover of my book, and we'll talk about the cover in a little bit, but there's some text on it by the artist who did the artwork. You'll see my information if you want to follow on Instagram. And for today, we'll say the talk is called Love, Care, and Imagining Otherwise. Okay, so let's see. I guess I got to switch over to PowerPoint. Okay, so this is actually a question for the audience. If we could get just a brief participation, which is, what is the story that we tell about adoption? Typically. So that is an open question for anyone who has ideas of when we think about adoption, what is the story we usually tell about it? Yeah.
I'll be brave and say that a lot of the times adoptions talk, I think, in two frameworks, right? A lot of it's about love, and I think the other part of it is about rescuing, right?
Yeah.
And that is, I think, something that kind of both the television and people's personal story.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Yeah, that's a great that's spot on, right? This idea that adoption is infused with love, and that oftentimes we're rescuing children who are in dire need, right? Anybody else know of, one in six people in the United States have a direct connection to adoption. They're either adopted, they're an adoptive parent, they're a birth parent, or they know someone in their family who's adopted. So yeah, is there anything else that we kind of say or have heard about adoption? Of course, yeah.
I'll keep talking
Yeah.
because I'm a archivist, so one of the other contexts that I have for adoption, especially if you work for the federal government, is about basically the forced like abduction and adoption of children outside of reservation into white communities.
Yeah.
And that it was such a problem and continues to be a problem that they had to legislate that if you were trying to adopt your children, that first they had to be adopted by internal community. And I think like within the last like 2 years, there was actually a Supreme Court case about that very
Right. Yeah. So you're extremely up to date on sort of what's been happening, and I love that that you have all that information. Yeah, and I would say that that's what some people, like maybe a very small minority of folks know and are aware of sort of the history of adoption of Native American children from Native tribes into white homes and the federal law that was passed, the Supreme Court cases that happened recently. Yeah, Nikos.
Often adoption is put forward as a last resort or a last alternative for couples who cannot have biological children, and also by anti-choice advocates as an alternative to a woman having an abortion.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You have, a situation where oftentimes a couple might be trying to have their own children, and they're unable to, and they sort of use adoption as an alternative way of creating families, right? And then, so the idea of creating a family or maybe expanding a family because maybe you had a child, but then you can't have any more children, these sort of things. And then the other thing you said was, oh yeah, the sort of the anti-choice, right?
It becomes
Yes.
part
And yeah, and we actually saw in the Dobbs decision, it was a footnote, but Amy Coney Barrett does sort of reference the quote unquote domestic supply of adoption as that people who cannot care for their children could sort of contribute to the domestic supply of adoption. So it is seen as an alternative, right? Yeah.
Observed as like secrecy and openness in which people know about adoption and or relationships with that they can control children, and then like from a tech perspective people discovering adoption with like genetic testing or social media and things like that, finding out that they have half brothers or siblings, and just like the fluidness of your own identity as you're trying to navigate that.
Yeah, and I think you're actually kind of describing maybe not the story that most people know, but the experiences that a lot of adoptees do in fact experience. And the term that is used is late discovery adoptee, where because of the way that we have sort of tried to replicate or make adoption mimic the biological family, the heterobiological family. We have closed records in the United States, in many states. That's kind of shifting. There's some states that have open records now where adoptees can have access to their birth certificate and they can see that information that most people have easy access to, right? And then, of course, there's a lot of adoptive parents who, whether it's their own choice or that they were advised early on in the process to keep the adoption secret from their child, yeah, that this sort of thing happens, right? So thank you for sort of kind of talking through this with me, because the title, the violence of love it could be jarring, especially for people who are maybe like close to adoption and have found a lot of joy and love because of it. So there is that story that we tell, and here are some things, right? Here's kind of my very, very, very short list, right? We're talking about adoption produces a loving home, and not just any loving home, but a permanent, forever home, right? And the term that is often used is forever family. The idea of creating or expanding a family, as we just mentioned. This other aspect, and it's kind of linked to the rescue part, is that you're rescuing a child who's in dire need. Maybe they are in foster care, maybe they're in an orphanage, maybe they, live on a reservation. And so you're removing them from harm and creating, providing a really sort of bright future for the child. And that the child should then feel lucky and grateful. And so this is a question that's, or even a expectation that's kind of placed onto a lot of adoptees. So, really quickly, maybe I'll just introduce myself. My name is Kip Myers, and I was adopted from Hong Kong when I was almost 4. I stayed in 4 different orphanages in Hong Kong. And the story of my relinquishment is a really challenging one that I, found out about more recently. And it was kind of forced upon my mother to relinquish me. And by her family, by her mother. And so I get adopted to Oregon by my wonderful family. And I had a brother. He's pretty much the same age as me. He's six months older. We grew up in a small town. So has anybody been to Atwater? Okay, smaller than Atwater, right? It's about less than half the size of Atwater. So 12,000 people at the time I was growing up. We lived outside of the town on a miniature farm, 2.5 acres, really beautiful place. We had a overgrown Christmas tree farm in the backyard. We had a creek back there that we'd play, hours and hours. And when I say miniature farm, I mean that we had like a bunch of miniature animals. We had miniature pigs, miniature goats, miniature donkeys. Yes.
What town was it in?
Well, it's Canby, Oregon. Yeah, near Oregon City, Wilsonville. Yeah. And so I had a great childhood growing up in that regards, right? I had a loving family. I lived in this cool area that was very beautiful. And my brother and I, we had a good relationship. Of course, we fought, as all brothers do. He even like threw miniature donkey shit at me one time. And yeah, so that's what people do, what brothers do. And the poop was it looked regular sized. Yeah, luckily it was dry, but it still was quite gross. And so I kind of give you that background because I think a lot of people, especially when adoptees express any sort of criticism about the adoption industry, oftentimes people presume that child had a sort of a outlier of an experience, that their relationship with their family must be bad, and that in general adoption is good, and that they're just kind of the outlier, the exception. And of course, my growing up was like not perfect. It was a very racially isolating town without racial mirrors. And adoption and my adoptive identity still impacted, the dynamics of the family in different ways. The colorblind ideology was kind of the perspective that my parents took earlier on. So we tell this story about adoption, and the other aspect of this is that, I worked at a summer camp. Eventually, I go to University of Oregon, and after I graduate, I work at the summer camp that was specifically for transracial and transnational adoptees. And I meet over the 3 years that I worked, the 3 summers, I met literally over 1,000 young adoptees who are transnationally and transracially adopted, and their parents. I met many of the parents because the parents some of them would stay for a parent-only program, and I could see the love that they had for their kids. I could see the love that the kids had for their parents. And so even as I research adoption, and even as I hear the stories of other adoptees sort of really criticizing adoption, right? Having very strong feelings rooted in their own estrangement from their family, their own treatment, the instances in which their families, are voting for Trump and still claiming to love them. All of these things that are very sort of difficult to sort of match up with the discourse, right? So the book is trying to think through that, right? Think through the complexity of adoption. And so here's actually the original piece. This is by a Korean Australian adoptee. So, Korean adoptions, 200,000 Korean children get adopted to countries across the globe. Many of them, nearly 100,000 to the United States. And one of them, who ends up in Australia, Meg O'Shea, did this illustration series for National Adoption Awareness Month. And this is this is the 10th illustration in the series. I don't know if it's the exact 10th, but it's something like that. It's in the middle of the series. But so the words are hers. With awareness comes a slow feeling that moves from mind to gut, a realization that even the happiest adoption stories must begin. And then, so I use this as the cover to be a little bit more abstract, but this is the second image. This is the next image, right? So adoption stories must begin with the separation of mother and child. And so when we talk about, the concept of the violence of love, I'm really thinking about how the condition of possibility for adoption, right? What makes adoption possible begins in the separation, which is violent, but like really thinking about what actually enables the separation, what sort of structural, what ideological and institutional policies sort of enable a situation in which a person who has a child feels compelled to relinquish that child, or where that child is taken away involuntarily, right? There's a hand. Yeah. No, that's in total. Yeah. So I think what I'll do now is I'm going to read a little bit from my introduction, and then I'll give you kind of an outline of what the book does. So here we go. I'll just read. All right. And this is text from the book. Typically, not all transracial and transnational adoptees grew up certain of one important aspect about themselves. Adoption was the best thing that happened to them. As we grow older, however, many adoptees slowly begin to understand the complexity of adoption and the violence of family separation, unknown pasts, inaccessible records, secrets and fabrications, and racial difference that accompanies the loving parts of adoption, and the contradictions of love and commerce. Possessing this knowledge, we are confronted with a dichotomous choice presented by adoption discourse. We stay happy and grateful, or we become angry and resentful. Rarely is there a space for adoptees who have had a loving, let alone horrible, childhood, choose to critique or question certain or all aspects of adoption. As Black transracial adoptee author and thought leader Angela Tucker, in her epigraph, in the epigraph that I sort of begin the book with, she says, to be honest about their experience is to hurt someone. So to be honest about their experience is to hurt someone. So here's, I'd flip some pages to get the next portion. And so my research intervenes into adoption discourse and practice by complicating how we analyze the personal and political aspects of adoption. The book is not just about love and violence. It's about the violence of love, how violence creates the conditions for and then infiltrates, permeates, and surrounds love. The ultimate question has less to do with what is love and adoption, and is it present in a particular adoptive context? Typically, love is present and sometimes abundantly. Rather, we might focus on what does love do in or through adoption. Exploring these questions, I argue that adoption and statements affirming adoption are forms of love that have operated at the personal and familial, at the agency and industry, and at this larger legal transnational level. So love here is about the historical and geographical distribution of life and death, based on notions of lovability and who can love best. I'll repeat that last sentence. Love here is about the historical and geographical distribution of life and death. Who is determined to be lovable? And we think about the child as a sacred human versus the person who helped bring the child into the world as someone who could be allowed to not be cared for, right? The prominent love through attachment framework erases emotional ambivalence, doubt, and anger by replacing them with certainty, this idea of true love. So in this normative economy of love, love is always idealistic, factual, authentic, and credible. While other effective responses by adoptees, such as anger, are signifiers of fear or detachment disorder that sort of get pathologized as not being grateful, mental health issue, stuff like that. What becomes clear is adoption can be loving, and those who are intimately attached to adoption can experience it and believe it as such. Nevertheless, to only focus on adoptive love would be an oversight. As Black feminist scholar Bell Hooks reminds us, everywhere we learn that love is important, and yet we are bombarded by its failure. So this book examines the adoption of Black, Asian, and Native American children by white families in the United States and considers the ways that ideas around race, gender, and the nation have informed our beliefs about which families and which homes and spaces can provide love and full life in relation to those that cannot. And it interrogates how representations of love inform these concepts and ultimately policies that support some families over others. So it's thinking really, I mean, it sort of prioritizes race and gender, but it's thinking about nation and indigeneity and these other things, and thinking about how race, our ideas of race are placed onto not only certain bodies that are unable or to care for their children, but the spaces in which those bodies inhibit, right? And we think about, again, Korea, China, Vietnam. We could go on, I don't talk about them in the book as much, but we could go to Ethiopia, Colombia, Guatemala, right? All of these countries in which transnational adoption has been very prominent. And there's multiple common themes. One is maybe a theme of communism, right? Or the threat of communism. One could be or socialism. And the other is this idea of poverty and sort of the government ineptitude to take care of their own children. And that the life in the United States becomes positively racialized. So this not only the white family, but the space of the United States, right? So how is space sort of racialized, and how is time then racialized too? Because if that person is not adopted, then their future becomes predetermined by their sort of racial, quote unquote, the social construction of their race determines their future, right? That they would have a bad future, right? One in which could, result in early death. Whereas, when someone is adopted, their future is positively racialized, right? So thinking about the way that space and time sort of are shaped by ideas of race. So in this way, adoption is not just an event. It's not just a legal procedure or descriptor, but more broadly an institution, an industry, and a discursive formation. And to reiterate my earlier point, adoption is temporal and spatial, not just in that it traverses across space and time, bringing children from one place to another place, which it does, but that it defines and fixes space as violent or modern, and time, past, present, and future. So adoption is inherently a violent process, one in which the problem of violence cannot be solved. And so I argue that love operates within and shapes transracial and transnational adoptions, but that there's these relational formations of race. And when I say relational formations of race, I say, again, how is the construction of the space of the racial other, the reservation, the inner city, the Asian country, how is that racialized in relation to the United States and the white home? And the violence of, but relational formulations of race and the violence of love are integral to how adoption, family, and nation are socially constructed. And so the purpose of the book is to venture on this eminent task of acknowledging and confronting this uneasy nature of adoption by rethinking theories of family and kinship that might offer alternative forms of relationality and care beyond adoption. So here is my chapter outline. So chapter 1 is a genealogy of transracial and transnational adoption. And in this chapter, I'm thinking through adoption, the genealogy, not just history, but genealogy, because of the way that history kind of narrates this. Typically, when we think about history, it kind of narrates this really cohesive story. Like good history will acknowledge that there's these gaps and these contradictions, but the larger historical narrative will say that this happened, and it tells a very sort of smooth story. But genealogy sort of thinks about the gaps and these like different lines of connection. And so I'm really thinking about how do the adoption of Asian, Black, and Native American children sort of intersect? What are the ways in which those histories intersect? Because oftentimes they're narrated separately, but they have these different origins and they have these different trajectories. And so what is the purpose of bringing these things together to sort of understand, again, the story we tell about adoption? And part of what I do in chapter 1 is to think through this idea of biopolitics, which is a fancy word to describe the management of life, how does the government, how does the state manage life? And there's this moment, this historical moment when the governments start using the family as a way to manage the larger population, right? And so it is through the family that you can get sort of consenting citizens. And if you create a family in such a way, then you can sort of determine who gets to be a part of the nation, who will get services, who won't, all of these things. And so I talk about biopolitics in this chapter and the management of life and death. So there's this phrase that biopower is the power to make live and let die. Whereas earlier power was about the right to take away life. So, the executioner takes away life, the king or the monarch or whatever, they say you no longer live and I'm going to take away your life. But the biopolitics is now saying we're actually more concerned with how do we proliferate and manage life and make live, right? Make a population live. And so adoption becomes a tool. Adoption and family formation becomes a tool to sort of make certain people live while letting others die. Chapter 2 is the new normal, positively defining adoptive motherhood and family. And so one of the things I talked about earlier was this idea that adoption is kind of thought of as second best, right? That the natural family, the biological family, is sort of the first option for most people. And so that adoption was considered second best, and adoptive families were kind of told as much, right? In television, in conversations, and all of these things, right? And so social workers, a social worker in particular, created positive adoption language, right? This new language that tries to put a positive spin on adoption. And you had social scientists who were doing these outcome studies, and they were trying to measure the happiness of a child, the ethno-racial pride that a child has, all of these things, right? Education outcomes. And the social scientists, essentially, their understanding of race is very basic, right? And they're asking the child when they're very young these questions rather than when they're adults, or asking them when they're young and then later when they're adults. Or they're asking they're asking their adoptive parents, what is the outcome of the adoption? And so you're getting this very skewed perspective, either the perspective of a child who hasn't fully formulated their understanding of adoption, or they're getting the perspective of the adoptive parent, which becomes very sort of self-selecting, right? When you have a study and somebody answers the study, the person who is answering the study is most often going to be the one who had the best experience, right? It's not going to be the parents whose adoption dissolved even before it was finalized, or the adoptive parents whose child is estranged from them now, right? And so there was all of these things that the studies were sort of doing, but then they were claiming that these studies were evidence that adoption was a purely good thing, right? That there's no sort of reason to question these transnational and transracial adoptions. So this effort to, and I would argue this loving effort, right, to take adoptive families and to normalize them, right, is this loving effort. But when we try to do that, it sort of creates this relational sort of devaluing of the birth relations. Chapter 3 is color evasive love and freedom from violence. And chapter 3, I'm looking at a lot of federal state laws, or a lot of federal adoption laws. One of the adoption laws in the mid-90s says you can no longer consider race in adoptive placements. So we're no longer going to try to place Black children with Black families. And a lot of us might say, well, that's not, I mean, we should actually not consider race. That's a good thing. Like children should be placed in any family that's available, right? But what was happening historically was that the government was taking children away from Black parents and homes because they deemed that home to be neglectful or criminal or, whatever term, or too poor, right? And so you have this situation that is not actually addressing the root cause, right? And then you had another federal law that's passed at the exact same time, two other federal laws. One was the welfare reform that some of you might be familiar with, that sort of ends welfare as we know it. So on the one hand, you're taking away welfare from families who desperately need it. And then on the other hand, they passed, in that same year, they passed an adoption tax credit where they decided we will give adoptive families $5,000 to adopt a child. So the government is making a biopolitical calculus of how do we make life, right? Do we make life by supporting the birth family, or do we make life by taking that child out of that family and putting them into a different family, right? And this was what was happening on the reservations too, right? Social workers were making these determinations and removing children in mass, right? That to the point where 25% of Native American children at one time had been removed from their homes, right? So that's chapter 3, and this idea of freedom from violence, that these things are justified because of this discourse of removing a child from this violent space, right? Love, life, and death, opposite futures, and protecting their own subjects. I mean, this could be the title for really most of the book, but it's talking about the adoption of Asian children and the discourse around one again of course love of producing a life for this child who would have had no life in the orphanage, and if they aren't adopted, especially in the orphanage context, then they would die. And then the protection of the wrong subjects, right? Opposite futures is, I hope that becomes clear when I say, yeah, if you're adopted, you'll have life, and if you aren't adopted, you'll die. That's the opposite future part. The protecting the wrong subjects part is in congressional hearings, which is one of the primary sources I use for a couple of these chapters, where lawmakers are talking about adoption and like, why are they doing these sort of things? And there's multiple times where lawmakers are saying, I understand that there are some bad practices in adoption. And this is like the shorter version, right? When you say bad practice, we're talking about the stealing of children from Asian mothers who are vulnerable, right? Paying the mothers to take the children, telling the parents that we're just going to take your child to the city for an education, all of these things, right? This happened in almost every country. Again, Guatemala, Ethiopia, Vietnam, Nepal, India, China, Korea. The Associated Press just did a long expose on adoptions from Korea and all the fabricated records. And so these lawmakers are saying, we understand that there are some bad things that happen, but we cannot shut the whole system down every time a bad thing happens. And we must protect adoptive families who are trying to create and expand their home. And so it was very clear from the language, right, that who was being protected. Like the focus actually wasn't on the child or on these families that were being taken advantage of, right? It was on the adoptive parents, the prospective adoptive parents who were what I sort of say were the subjects of law, like the law was made for them, as opposed to the targets of law. Eliminating the native and privileging of white rights and adoptive couple versus baby girl. Somebody in the audience mentioned these Supreme Court cases. There's two. One of them happened in 2013, and it's this really, it sort of blows your mind court case where the Supreme Court, it goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and essentially this Cherokee father had sort of over text message relinquished his rights over text message to the birth mother, and the birth mother chose to relinquish the child for adoption. But once he found out that the child was going to be adopted and that she was not going to parent the child, once he found that out, he tried to intervene and stop the adoption. And the tribe tried to intervene and stop the adoption. And there was a whole bunch of other stuff that went on behind the scenes where it's too complicated. It's such a complicated story. But essentially, the dad wanted to parent the child, but because the adoption process had already started, right, the adoptive parents continued to have custody of the child. Eventually, the lower court rules in favor of the father because of that very law that you mentioned, which was enacted by Congress to protect Indian families from the theft of their children, which had happened for decades and decades. And you think about boarding schools decades before that. And so here you have this case where the parent wants to parent the child. But then it goes to the Supreme Court because the white family really wants to parent this child. And so again, when we think about this, oftentimes we couch this idea that Native Americans have special rights, unearned rights, because we think of them as a minority group rather than as a political entity that is essentially similar to how we think of Canada and Mexico, right? That tribes are sovereign countries. And so this is like a transnational adoption, right? And so we have this instance where a family feels as if they will be a better future for this child. And ultimately, the Supreme Court agrees in a very twisted way, saying that the Indian father never had custody of the Indian child, and therefore there was never an Indian family to separate. There's a lot more in the details of that case about the sort of level of his Indianness, that he was not Indian enough, and that if we gave rights to people who are not Indian enough, then anybody could claim Indianness and anybody could get those rights that Native Americans have. So the chapter is about that, right? And here I'll wrap up. Oops, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. So in the conclusion, I return to love. And Sarah Med, who's a scholar, asks, how has politics become a struggle over who has the right to name themselves as acting out of love? And again, if we return to Bell Hooks, she reminds us there can be no love without justice. But at the same time, there's, I sort of am following Frantz Fanon, who says, today I believe in the possibility of love. That is why I endeavor to trace its imperfections, its perversions. And also James Baldwin, who says, love takes off masks that we fear we cannot live without and know we cannot live within. And so the project that I'm sort of put forth in the book is both academic and sort of showing the evidence, but it's also an invitation that if we really want to think about love, what does love actually mean? And when we think about adoption, what are we like trying to do in adoption? And how are the things that we're trying to do not really the things that we're doing, right? And so if that's the case, then what else could we do instead of adoption, right? And so in the conclusion, I talk about native kinship and give the example of like tribal customary adoptions, where there's not the permanent, it's called TPR, right? the transfer of parental rights, um, where there's not the permanent transfer of parental rights. Because in adoption, you have to end the rights of one person or multiple people to adopt that child to a new home, right? And so in tribal customary adoptions, they say, actually, we don't want to do that because oftentimes the person who is adopting the child is a family member. And what does that mean to like sort of say that this person is no longer connected to you legally, right? What sort of violence is sort of being enacted there? So we think about native kinship, and we think about, I talk about reproductive justice, right? And not just reproductive rights, but reproductive justice reminds us that we should protect the right to not have children, the right to have children, and the right to parent children in safe and healthy environments. And so it is that last part, right? That is key when thinking about love and care. And then I talk about abolition, which is for many people sort of a scary and misunderstood word, right? And my Twitter, my Instagram handle is abolish and build. And so does that second part. What do we abolish something because it's not working and it's producing more harm than good, but we build. What do we build in place of that? And so I talk about abolishing adoption as the epitome of care, understanding that there are moments and there are sort of iterations of adoption, like in the, in the Black community, right? Informal adoption has existed, that can do the things that it purports to do. But if we when we uphold it as the epitome of care, then we actually forget how to care for everybody else, right? Because adoption actually only helps so many people, right? We cannot adopt all the children in the world, right? But that's what a lot of the lawmakers want to do. They want to use transnational adoption to supposedly save, the thousands of children who are in need, right, across the world. And so what is, with abolition, how can we center not just children, but birth parents and think about family systems theory and impact analysis? So it's not just thinking about the individual. And as I wrote in the introduction, if we did this, the answer can be finding new ways to support current love, not pathologize struggling love, not criminalize imperfect love. It also means enabling kinship love, even if that love emanates from an older, smaller house that is in a poor neighborhood next to a failing school, because there are social and historical reasons for why those things exist that have nothing to do with how much a person might love and care for a child. And so I'll just end with, I hope that the book moves readers to think and act and be differently. Not just in adoption, but in general, right? And that the adoption community is brimming with writers and artists and poets who have produced trenchant narratives and imagery, helping us understand the pain, happiness, and complexity of adoption in new ways, and that it's a good time to find adoptee voices and listen with love. Thank you. Yeah, Kristen.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Myers. This, it was great book, great presentation, and definitely gave me a lot to think about. And,
I was thinking about just on a sort of personal note, my family, and so I have there's two aunts and uncles that my mom's parents, my grandparents, adopted. And, I grew up and they were kind of just, I just looked up to them as my aunt and uncle. But, I certainly understood even, when I was a child, that, so they were adopted when they were already sort of pre-teens, so pretty, pretty well, they already had a relationship with their biological mom. And so, I understood the dynamic, in the house as complicated, and I could see very clearly that, they felt, that violence, as far as being taken from their mother. And I understood, that the story was, that the biological mother of my aunts and uncle, was dealing with addiction. And this was not a, my aunts and uncles, they're African American or Black, and my family's Black. So it's not, they're from, from the States. So it's not a situation of a transracial
Mhm.
adoption. But yeah, so I feel like that, that sort of that violence part of it, was evident because, they were where they had, they knew, very much that they were removed from the family, the house that they knew. But, I know that my grandparents, felt they were doing something very loving. And so the question that you asked sort of in the end about who is viewed as sort of having a right to love, or I'm paraphrasing and things like that. So I was thinking about that question, and when I think about the dynamic, I sort of understood what my aunts and uncles went through as, being very painful and having experienced that violence. And I also, I'm sort of thinking about that, and, and thinking about how much, just associating that with the love that they, could
Felt
for
for their
their
biological mother. And
so,
so, I don't know, I'm just sort of
processing
processing and kind of being,
based on what you're presenting and these different family dynamics. And I was also just, curious, even though the situation in my family is not exactly the kind of research, that you're doing, but if if you did look into the sort of differences based on when children enter adoptive family.
Right. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. So the first part, it makes, yeah, I mean, it's absolutely true. And I do think that, like, what I'm trying to sort of articulate in the book is applicable with same race adoptions, whether they're within, like, the African American community, or within, even within sort of with white domestic adoptees, right? I mean, there's this whole baby scoop era where there's tens of thousands of children who are taken away from their mothers, right? Oftentimes, like, in the hospital, right? Maybe they were told that their child had died, or maybe they were just forcibly, sort of involuntarily taken away. They're sort of coerced to sign paperwork. Any number of things happened, and the idea was that if we completely remove this child from this person's life, right, that was going to give them this better future, rather than thinking, oh, what if if this person really is not in the condition to care for this child, maybe they have illness with drugs, then why do we need to actually terminate those rights? And because what happens now is you have parents who they don't meet the timeline. So then their child is taken away from them, right? And they're put into foster care. So they have no legal right to their children. And the child has no legal right to a relationship with their parents. So if they get sick in the hospital, the parent can't legally come to the hospital, right? And so then you have, like, tens of thousands of kids in foster care who actually never get adopted. And so they exit foster care now, not only having not been adopted, but having no legal attachment to their parents. And so you had, like, this issue, you have this current issue with adoption, but even before that, when we're talking about decades ago, right? This idea that a person who is struggling couldn't be involved in the life of the child at a later point in time, right? That was just kind of the de facto assumption. And that the only way to be a good parent is to relinquish your child. That's literally the only thing you can redeem. The way that you could redeem yourself is to relinquish that child. And so I think and then on the other side of it is, adoptive parents feel like, okay, they're bringing this child into their home and providing this child their love. And you have many cases of that. And then you have other cases where, and it's not just like one or two cases, there's many cases where that child, I mean, we have the Cinderella story, which is like a stepchild sort of situation, but it is very similar, where a child gets adopted and they essentially become the sort of lowest child in the family who does all the work. I mean, we've seen the horror stories of children who have been, kept in the basement or who have been murdered by their adoptive families, or in a case with a Russian adoption, sent back on a plane. Reuters did an expose in which they went on Yahoo groups. I think it was Yahoo, maybe Facebook. I think it was Yahoo groups. And it's a whole economy of adoptive parents saying, I can't take care of my child anymore. I need somebody else to take it for me. And it's this very informal black market transfer, because there's no social worker involved, there's no lawyer involved. And so you have this, it's called rehoming. And we understand the term rehoming through pets, right? A pet is rehomed. Well, this happens with children, right? And it was hundreds of children that just their investigation sort of revealed alone in a very short time period, right? So if you think of over the years and decades and stuff, that this sort of thing happens, right? And then in the case like right now, there's a lot of transnational adoptees. The estimate is that 20,000 transnational adoptees don't have their citizenship because it wasn't something that adoption agencies like had adoptive parents do. It was like the responsibility of the parents to get their child naturalized. Well, many parents didn't know they had to. They just assumed that their child would get it. And so we've had, over the last few decades, dozens of adoptees who are raised their whole life in the United States, deported back to their home country, where they don't know the language, they don't know anybody, they don't know where their birth family is, and all of these things. So, right, it kind of, there's like, what do you do with the range of things that happen in adoption, right? And so the book is trying to capture that range. It's trying to capture these dynamics that really center love and try to carry that to its fullest, and then the dynamic that is under the surface but is kind of happening all the time, right? In my class, I talk about the iceberg metaphor and what we see on the top versus what's underneath the water, that gigantic piece of iceberg that's underneath the water. Did you have a?
Yeah, so I work as a volunteer at FOSTA, which for those who don't know is Court Appointed Special Advocate. So I work with kids in the foster system. We usually just have one at a time on hotline case. And that involves going to family court. In here in Merced County is, very much the story that we've been telling this whole time. It's predominantly Hispanic or like indigenous children or native, whether they have tribal status or not. Who, their parents maybe get involved with drugs or some kind of illness. Sometimes it's like there's abuse from the biological parent at some point. Typically, the parental rights are terminated, or they will be defined with a case plan certificated by the social worker. Then the child can be restored to the parent. And then oftentimes there is an adoption involved. Sometimes they never get adopted. But I'm really curious about this specific case, because I've never thought about this. A case where a child is adopted who does not have citizenship, who does not become naturalized, and then is deported as an adult. And so I guess I'm wondering, like, what do you do about that? Because, obviously, like, there are some things you can do in terms of making sure all the parents know that have naturalized their citizens, or the children as citizens before. But when you have a child, they take it through a court case, and their legal parental rights are terminated, and then they just become a citizen of nowhere. It seems really hard to imagine how that child then in the future is going to like go through the system and become citizen. So I guess A, can you just kind of like speculate on all the biopolitics involved? And B, sort of more pragmatically, like, is there something that we can do as community members, and in particular for those of us that are already involved in the foster care?
Yeah. Thank you for that. Sorry, thank you for that question. I mean, yeah, I mean, it was actually, Congress realized that this was an issue in the late 1990s, 1999. They started working on, they had a hearing. And at first, like one of the things on the table was retroactive citizenship for every child who was adopted, retroactive citizenship. What they landed on was that any child who was adopted and still under the age of 18 would get automatic citizenship. So in 2001, when it sort of went into effect, every child, and I forgot what they said, like, it's in my book. I want to say like 90,000, or I can't remember the exact number. They're like, 90,000 citizens overnight. And so they just had to like apply for the paperwork and they would get it, right? They would get their certificate. But they explicitly excluded anyone who's over 18, right? And that had already happened, right? People were, the cases were like writing a bad check. And so any sort of crime that was one sort of considered that had sort of a $1,000 fine attached to it, it was a deportable offense. And there was no sort of, the judge could not provide any discretion in these cases, because I think most judges, if they had discretion, would have sort of understood, okay, this person is removed from the family, they've grew up here their whole lives, they only speak this language, they consider this family their family, and all of these things. But judges didn't have discretion, and so then they were deported. Another case was a Korean adoptee. He was abused in Michigan, and then he went into like the Michigan foster care system. He goes to Oregon, and he's adopted again, and he's abused by his adoptive parents in Oregon. And then when he sort of leaves that home, he like breaks into his house and takes his belongings. Like, he had a Bible and some Korean clothing, and he ends up going to jail for a longer time than his abusive adoptive parents. And then he got deported. And he had a wife and kids. And so you have these instances, and you're just wondering like why? Like this again, the story that we tell about adoption would say this would never happen. And and part of the reason is again because we sort of uphold adoption as the epitome of care. And so there's many people who would say that is unjust, but the separation and deportation of other families, well, that's just, that's okay, right? But when we're looking at the reason why they didn't include the retroactive part and make all, just erase the problem, there would be no problem, because everyone adopted from 2001 on would get automatic citizenship, and everyone who is 18 or younger would get automatic citizenship. So it's just the people who are 19 and older. And so those, 20 to 50,000, those are estimates. It's because Congress said at some point we have to hold lawbreakers accountable. And so if you do a crime, you have to pay the time, right? And so it is this very sort of neoliberal, conservative, tough on crime, individual responsibility sort of aspect. And there have been adoptees who have been working literally since 2001 for 24 years to try to get a new piece of legislation passed that will give retroactive citizenship. You would think this would be so easy, but year after year, it never moves. Yeah. The other thing was, pragmatic about foster care.
Yeah, like, I mean, sounds like maybe the problem, first there are the extant cases where there are still people who are holding the right. But if I'm understanding you right, like the children that I'm dealing with now will all become citizens and not have.
Yeah, but I mean, that's only if they're adopted from another country. Right.
Oh.
Yes.
So if they're an undocumented child who's already here.
Yeah, if they're undocumented child who's already here, that's a totally different story. And I don't know how, I don't actually don't know how that works. But what I do know is that adoption, I mean, that's in many ways, like, I think conservatives are very excited about this possibility of deporting and separating a family and then having a child who they could save and rescue. And so I don't think it's a top concern to figure out a way to stop separating families for a lot of people. Nicosia, and then,
I was just wondering how it works in terms of immigration law and visa type. So
If you're
if you're
adopting
adopting
a
a
child
child
from
from
another
another
country,
country, you get a J1 visa for them.
you get an orphan visa. Like, you used to get something like a different type of immigration visa, but now it's like a designated orphan visa.
and
And
then
then
that
that expires
after
after a certain time period, and then you have to apply for a green card.
for the child.
Well, I mean, are you talking about now?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think now it's like they kind of, yeah, I don't know that sort of transition moment. The only thing I'm certain of is that there's the category of orphan visa, and then that once they are adopted, both in their home country and then again, they have to be adopted twice in the United States. Then once that happens, then they become naturalized citizens.
So then you can.
It's an automatic. You don't even have to apply for the citizenship. You just get it, and then I think you probably have to pay the $400, $500 fee.
And then
Prior to that, the case that you referred to, was it that
he had an orphan visa and then no one.
Yes, no one applied for, yeah,
or
yeah. Oh yeah, I think you had your hand up first, maybe. Yeah. Mhm.
I was thinking back to your question about the story
and
about adoption. I'm wondering about the stories of adopted parents too. We can talk a little bit about the different perspectives and experiences. And specifically, I've got a good friend of mine whose sister died a couple of years ago, and she has taken custody of he was 12 at the time, her son. This is my friend's nephew.
Yeah.
And she's working on all the legal nuances of like what does guardianship mean? Does she need a power of attorney to like talk to the nurse at school when he gets sick? All sorts of things are coming up. And this boy's father is an alcoholic. He leaves
Right.
the kid in an apartment for a week and goes on a bender, and the kid has to fend for himself. It's a
Yeah.
bad situation.
Yes.
And she and my good friend is in a situation where she never asked for this. She didn't want to
Right.
have a kid.
Yeah.
And now she's got a teenager.
Yeah.
And dealing with all these legal nuances, and it's a struggle. And
I
I know that she loves her nephew
Yeah.
deeply and wants to do the best for him, but some days she's like, I hate this, I don't want it, never asked for it. So I'm just curious about like the questions of love and the experiences of adoptive parents who are in situations where they didn't plan on or look for this.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for asking your question. And it actually turned in a different direction than I thought. But because, I mean, in terms of like adoptive parents, like their perspective, a lot of the lawmakers who are very invested in the adoption law were actually adoptive parents. Sometimes they admit that, sometimes they don't. A lot of researchers who are doing these outcome studies or really advocating, like going and testifying in front of Congress, they're adoptive parents. But they're also conducting the studies, right? Sort of proving unequivocally that these adoptive outcomes are positive, right? Undeniably positive. And And so in that way, like adoptive parents' voices have been very prominent, right, in the sort of discourse and the policy making and the practice of adoption. But then, of course, you have like a lot of adoptive parents who, they're not invested in the institution in the same way. They're like invested in their family, but they're not invested in the institution. And they understand very much that there's like all these problems with adoption. Like there's one legal scholar, his name's David Smolin. He's an evangelical Christian, and they adopted. And I think it was a part of the orphan sort of adoption movement in the evangelical community. He realized at some point that his children were stolen, and he tried to contact the State Department as a lawyer to have their children reunited with the parents. And the State Department was like, "It's too late. You can't. There's nothing we can do." And so you have like parents who are like, "What are we supposed to do in these sort of like now that all of these parents have watched the it was Associated Press did the story, but PBS Frontline ran the video of all of these Korean adoption cases, right? Where you have this record, oh, this child was abandoned, right? And it was found here. And then 40 kids have the exact same word for word, this child was abandoned here, right? And so, yeah, parents are like trying to grapple with that. Like, how do you love your child when you are sort of implicated in a institution like this? And there's organizations like Adoption Mosaic, and I did a couple events or a couple sort of engagements with them last week, and they have this program called Better Together, and it's adoptive parents and adoptees coming together in the same space and talking about all of these issues, right? The different feelings, the harms, the ways to try to heal, all of these things. It's all there on the table without judgment, for the purpose of trying to center the child and not center the adoptive parents. In the case that you kind of brought up, I mean, there's a lot of people who are trying to do the work of rethinking care, right? And so there's this new term called relational permanence, this idea that you could have adult figures in your life who are not parents, but are people that you trust, who you could rely on, who could be your sort of legal, the people you have legal ties to, who could come to the hospital, who could be there in court, whatever. But that there's multiple people. So it doesn't feel as if one person has to have all that responsibility, right? And so it's like it becomes really a manifestation of that term that we so often use flippantly, right? That it takes a village, right? It is that sort of more in practice.
And the term was relational
Permanence.
permanent. Thank you.
Yeah. Sholay, and then over here. Yeah.
Thank you so much. It was a very moving presentation. I'm interested in knowing, and this was brought up at the very beginning, when you started your research, was all of the sort of technological DNA ancestry kind of move discoveries, was that going on at the beginning? And then how did it change over time and change the story you're trying to tell?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a couple of adoptees whose research is on DNA, and in fact, I invited one of them a couple of years ago, and she talked about how like for the first part of your question is no. Like when I was starting this research, DNA testing was not a huge multi-billion-dollar industry. It now is, and of course, there's a lot of hesitancy around, for people to do it because these companies like own kind of that, it's proprietary, and but a lot of adoptees do it, and I did it, and I in fact found first cousins, and which eventually led me to a lot of other connections. But yeah, the person who's doing the research, she was talking about these moments where adoptees are like connecting with third and fifth cousins, which a lot of people Do you even know your third and fifth cousins? Yeah, I mean, and it's just like the connection is like great, 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 great grandparent, right? Um, but that there's like a significance there that they did not ever have before, that they would not have until maybe they had a biological child of their own. Um, and then there's this other aspect of what does kinship mean in a situation in which you are searching for your parents, but and you think you have found them because you go to the village and you post your picture, and that picture looks exactly what the child of you know of a couple maybe uh, who lost their child years and years and years ago, and you develop a relationship, and this happens right before DNA. This happened all the time, right? And you've created a kinship bond or a familial bond, and then you take the DNA test, and then the DNA test comes back negative. And so the idea of, in anthropology, the idea of kinship is very, kinship is a social construct. Even biological kinship is socially constructed. The meaning that we attach to biological kinship, we put so much importance on it, right? Is socially constructed because we know this because there's so many animals in the world in which their biological offspring have no meaningful attachment to the person who gave them life, right? So we have socially constructed and put meaning onto the biological kinship. And of course, that's not to discount, adoptees who are very invested in finding biological kin. But in this moment, it's like the reverse. You've like now connected with this family and you've made trips back to your home country and you've told them your story. They've told them yours. And can you still be family, right? So that's kind of what some of her research was looking at. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
In the beginning of your presentation, you talked about in general research into adoption has been focused heavily on positive outcomes. Since then, has there been a more holistic study about adoption so that way researchers, people who are involved with adoptions have like a better picture, or is that still a problem where it's only focusing on positive outcomes?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I absolutely think that there's more research out there. It is a much broader perspective, in part because like a lot of people who are adopted, have been adults for the last, 40 years in terms, and so uh, especially more recent, especially with transnational, I mean, Korean, 200,000 people that's a lot. And it's almost mind-blowing how many Korean adoptees go into research because they're like, all of this stuff is saying things that don't match what I feel or what I've experienced or what I've heard from all the people who I've met. And so then they go into sociology, they go into social work, they go into history or gender studies or ethnic studies or whatever, right? And so, yeah, there's a lot more voices out there. One person who was actually also adopted from Hong Kong. There's actually not very many who are adopted from Hong Kong. She's one of the most prominent adoption psychologists. Her research is really focused on adoptees, right? Adult adoptees, as opposed to, children, as opposed to adoptive parents. And so the research is definitely shifting, but the research hasn't necessarily impacted the dominant discourse as much, right? It's slowly transforming where I will run into people who work in the county. Like at my book talk on Sunday, there was somebody who worked in the county, and I always get anxious about what is this person going to think who works in the county, who's like sort of trying to help children who are in these really difficult, challenging circumstances. What are they going to think of my book? Are they going to say you're being too naive, whatever, etc.? And she works in the adoption and foster care system in Merced, and she had really wonderful things to say about the book. And so I think in that way, there's like a small shift. But by and large, the narrative that you see, especially during November, Adoption Awareness Month, and in general by politicians and stuff who are sort of influencing the policies and stuff, there's such a long way to go with that. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I'm in Arizona.
Oh.
My undergrad at Oregon University and my grad work at University of Arizona. And I knew a lot of Native Americans, both as co-workers and as fellow students and friends. I've known a lot of Native Americans from various tribes who were adopted and whose usually by white parents and whose parents did their level best to deracinate them.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
So a lot of the people I knew in college were people who went to that college specifically because they wanted to reconnect with their families and with their cultures.
Yeah.
So what I'm wondering is, have there been any studies on the success or non-success of people trying to whether it's Native Americans or someone else, some other group trying to reintegrate themselves into those cultures?
Yeah, thank you for that question, because it just jogged, all this. I mean, yeah, absolutely. You had, and that was with Native American adoptions. That's with other transnational adoptions from, Asia and Africa and Central and South America, where in some cases, like adoption agencies literally told the adoptive parents, you should try to minimize any attention to their racial or ethnic background or the culture, and as you said, deracinate, right? And that this is the best way to sort of mirror the natural family, to make them feel as if they're not different, and to make them feel as if they belong to the family. The other sort of situation, like my situation, was like we lived in a small town. There was nobody who's going to teach, Chinese language, or I didn't have access to like Chinese culture camp or any activities like that. And so part of that is on like adoptive parents and where they choose to live, even as they're like adopting a child of a different background, right? And that's what a lot of adoption agencies started doing, right? They're, the ones who are really thinking about this, like if you're planning to adopt a child of a different background and you are in a predominantly white area, you should rethink what you're doing and why you're doing it and how you're doing it, all those things, right? And so there's been a shift, but again, that effort to deracinate or to assimilate, and this is not to excuse like some of the white supremacist ideology sort of rooted in that, but part of it is that they thought they were doing this loving thing. Some of them. Some of them, of course, just hated the fact that their child had this culture and were saving them, right? They're literally saving them from this culture that could be sort of detrimental to their future. But others were doing kind of what they were told and thought was best for their child. And then you had like adoptive parents who started creating culture camps, right? That I just mentioned. Chinese culture camp, Korean culture camp, Camp Kimchi, La Samana camp, Ethiopian camp. And adoptive parents were creating these camps because it was supposed to be in response to the assimilation, deracination sort of efforts. And in doing that, it was like, again, out of this loving impetus. But oftentimes the culture camps were actually not talking about, well, where does this culture come from? And what did you lose in addition to culture? And it was a sort of superficial focus on culture because culture was like a safe thing. We can bring in some ethnic experts. We can learn alongside our children at this camp and provide a safe space where we can both learn about the culture. Whereas if we talk about birth parents or we talk about other forms of loss, then that's something we can't really know. We don't have answers for, and it's a much more difficult conversation, right? And so when I talk about the violence of love, that's kind of an example, right? That I actually do talk about in the book. Maybe, yeah, Demetra, if you want to do the last question.
I tend to think of what's come out when they need to, and I think this is important for this book to come out as we're entering or over to
Right. Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah.
we have what is like degrees of, right, like inherent violence of all corporations, and then you have state sanctioned cyber violence.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And so I wonder if there are more radical doing stuff being on the other end. Your research or what? If you cannot answer a question about taxes, actually, in like future classes, I know, but no, just if there's anything policy-wise or even for, you know, regular citizens that you might see your research.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for your comment. I mean, you made so many connections. I mean, the wounded child, no surviving family is just one of those, a term that you would never even imagine, right? No ancestors, right? No grandparents, no aunts, no uncles, no cousins, no. And so, yeah, there's certainly like these levels of violence. And then, you know, what do we do with that? How do we, you know, what do we do in this moment? And some of the quotes I talk about love, like Valerie Kaur, who's a Sikh, as I'll say, philosopher from Fresno. And she wrote this book called Revolutionary Love. And she talks about loving strangers, loving our enemies, and loving ourselves. And in this moment, it's so difficult to love our enemies. It is so difficult, like, because we feel like they have done so much harm, and they have, and it's real. But if we want to stop harm, in all the situations in which we try to stop harm, we oftentimes, like, we can like remove ourselves from the harm, and that's like one way to stop the immediate harm. But when we talk about like so many of the ways in which we need to stop harm at a sort of a larger level, we have to engage in a way, right? And to do that, it requires like the anger that is righteous to like move us to do something, and then the love to not necessarily forgive, but to sort of say, why is this happening, and how can we use love to like think differently? And so, I mean, I'm, you know, I'm idealistic, and I'm also sort of a realistic. And so for me, yeah, I'm trying to figure out how do we hold all those things. So yeah, thank you.
Dr. Myers, another round of applause.
Thank you so much for joining.